Imagine being told by a leading pollster that you are facing very, very large losses in elections that could be decisive for your future as Prime Minister. Not just losses, not just defeats, but specifically very, very large losses, with a double very emphasizing just how catastrophically bad things are about to get. That is a brutal warning that Lord Hayward, a Conservative peer and respected elections expert, has just delivered to Keir Starmer about the local elections scheduled for May 7th. We are not talking about a difficult night at the ballot box or some challenging results that require a bit of spin to get through. We are talking about a drubbing in Labour's heartlands in England, defeat in the Welsh Senedd, and what Lord Hayward colourfully described as a battering in the Scottish Parliament. The party is on course for massive losses to Reform UK, the Greens, the Liberal Democrats, and in East London, pro-Gaza independent candidates. This is shaping up to be an electoral apocalypse for Labour, the kind of comprehensive rejection by voters that end political careers and triggers leadership crises. The fact that a few months ago these elections looked like they would be decisive for both Labour and Conservative leaderships, but now it looks like they will decide the fate of Starmer and Rachel Reeves while being less clear that they will affect Kemi Badenoch, tells you everything about how dramatically the political landscape has shifted. Quick favour. If you are absolutely gripped by this unfolding electoral disaster that could change the entire direction of British politics, hit that subscribe button right now. Over 94% of you watching have not subscribed yet. It is completely free, takes literally 2 seconds, and helps us keep bringing you these moments where political predictions become genuinely explosive and careers hang in the balance. Cheers if you did. Now back to Starmer's impending electoral nightmare. Let us start with Lord Hayward himself, because understanding who is making these predictions is important for assessing their credibility. Lord Hayward is a Conservative peer, so you might be tempted to dismiss this as partisan political point scoring from someone who has every incentive to talk down Labour's prospects. But Hayward is also a highly respected elections expert and pollster who has built his reputation on accurate analysis rather than partisan wishful thinking. He is the kind of person whose predictions are taken seriously across the political spectrum precisely because he has a track record of calling elections correctly even when the results are uncomfortable for his own party. When someone like Lord Hayward says Labour is facing very, very large losses, people pay attention because he is not just engaging in political spin. The phrase very, very large losses is doing a lot of work in that warning. In political commentary, language tends to be carefully calibrated. You might say a party is facing losses, or significant losses, or even substantial losses. But very, very large losses is unusually emphatic language that suggests something genuinely catastrophic is about to happen. It is the kind of language you use when the data is so bad that understating it would be dishonest. Lord Hayward is essentially saying that based on everything he is seeing in the polling and on the ground, Labour is about to experience one of the worst local election performances by a governing party in modern British history. The elections taking place on May 7th are genuinely significant in their scope and could not be more politically important. Council elections are due in all 32 London boroughs, which is an enormous electoral battleground covering millions of voters across one of the world's most important cities. London has traditionally been a Labour stronghold, particularly in recent years as the capital has become increasingly diverse and increasingly hostile to Conservative politics. If Labour starts losing councils in London, where they should be strongest, it represents a fundamental collapse in their support base. The elections are also taking place in Birmingham, Britain's second-largest city, in Greater Manchester, which has been a Labour stronghold for generations, in Tyneside, another traditional Labour area, and across the home counties, which have historically been more conservative but where political allegiances have been shifting. On top of the local elections in England, devolved elections are taking place in Scotland and Wales, which add an additional layer of complexity and potential disaster for Labour. These are not just local council seats. These are elections to the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Senedd, which have significant powers over health, education, transport, and other policy areas. Losing these elections would not just be embarrassing, it would represent a fundamental loss of political power and influence across large parts of the United Kingdom. The fact that all of these elections are happening on the same day creates what political strategists call a Super Thursday, where the cumulative impact of results coming in from across the country can create an overwhelming narrative that is very difficult to counter or spin. Lord Hayward's comment that a few months ago it looked as if May 7th will be decisive for the leaderships of both Labour and Conservatives is revealing because it shows how dramatically the political situation has changed. A few months ago, Both major parties were struggling. Both leaders were facing questions about their political futures, and it seemed like the May elections might deliver a double blow that could trigger leadership crises in both parties. But as we move into 2026, the situation has evolved in a way that is much more dangerous for Starmer than for Badenoch. The Conservatives are still expected to lose seats overall, but the expectation that these results will be decisive for Badenoch's leadership has diminished. That suggests either that Conservative expectations have been lowered to the point where anything other than total catastrophe will be seen as acceptable, or that Badenoch has consolidated a position within the party to the extent that even poor results will not trigger a leadership challenge. For Starmer and Rachel Reeves, the stakes could not be higher. The prediction that the May election could decide their fate is not hyperbole. It is a serious assessment of the political reality they face. If Labour suffers a kind of very, very large losses that Lord Hayward is predicting, the questions about Starmer's leadership will become deafening. Labour MPs who are looking at these results and thinking about their own prospect of the next general election will start seriously asking whether Starmer is capable of turning things around or whether the party needs new leadership to have any hope of recovering. Rachel Reeves, as Chancellor and the architect of the budget that has been so politically toxic, will be particularly vulnerable because MPs would have a clear scapegoat to blame for the government's economic failures and political unpopularity. The prediction of a cacophony of winners is a brilliant phrase that captures the fragmentation of British politics and the collapse of the traditional two-party system. In the old days, elections were primarily contests between Labour and the Conservatives, with the Liberal Democrats occasionally picking up seats but fundamentally operating within a two-party framework. Now we are looking at a situation where Reform UK, the Greens, the Liberal Democrats, pro-Gaza independents, and various regional parties are all winning seats, creating a complex multi-party political landscape where no single narrative dominates. A cacophony of winners means lots of different parties celebrating victories, lots of different political messages being validated by voters, and a fundamentally more chaotic and unpredictable political environment. The claim that Reform UK, starting from a low base, is likely to make the most gains is particularly significant for understanding what is happening in British politics. Reform currently has very few local councillors because it is a relatively new political force that is focused primarily on national politics and parliamentary elections. But that low base means that any success in the local elections will show up as dramatic percentage gains that create powerful headlines and momentum. If Reform goes from having a handful of councillors to having hundreds, even though that might still be a small fraction of the total number of council seats available, it will be presented and perceived as a Reform surge that validates Nigel Farage's political strategy and suggests his party is genuinely building a grassroots political infrastructure that could threaten both Labour and the Conservatives at the next general election. The specific mention of pro-Gaza independent candidates winning in East London is fascinating because it highlights how Labour has alienated parts of its traditional support base over foreign policy issues. East London has significant Muslim populations in areas like Tower Hamlets, Newham, and Waltham Forest, and Labour's position on the Israel-Gaza conflict has been deeply unpopular with many Muslim voters who feel the party has not been sufficiently critical of Israeli actions and supportive of Palestinian rights. The emergence of independent candidates specifically campaigning on Gaza demonstrates how single-issue politics can break through traditional party loyalties when voters feel sufficiently strongly about something. If Labour starts losing council seats in East London to pro-Gaza independents, it represents both a practical loss of political power and a symbolic rejection of Labour's foreign policy by communities that have historically been core Labour supporters. Lord Hayward's prediction that Labour is on course for one hell of a battering in Scotland is particularly devastating because it suggests the party's attempt to rebuild its position in Scotland after years of SNP dominance has completely failed. Labour used to be the dominant force in Scottish politics, winning dozens of seats and forming the bedrock of their parliamentary majorities. But the rise of the SNP, accelerated by the 2014 independence referendum, destroyed Labour's Scottish base and reduced them to a rump presence. The 2024 general election saw some recovery for Labour in Scotland as the SNP struggled with its own internal problems and declining popularity. But if Labour is now facing one hell of a battering in the Scottish Parliament elections, it suggests that recovery was temporary and superficial, and that Scottish voters remain deeply sceptical of Labour's ability to represent their interests. The suggestion that the SNP, Reform, and the Greens could all do well in Scotland create a fascinating three-way dynamic. The SNP remains a dominant force in Scottish politics despite recent difficulties, and would love nothing more than to deliver a comprehensive defeat to Labour to prove that Scottish voters have not forgiven or forgotten Labour's past behaviour. Reform-making gains in Scotland would be genuinely remarkable because Scotland has generally been more left-wing and socially liberal than England, and Nigel Farage's brand of politics has historically struggled to gain traction north of the border. If Reform starts winning seats in Scotland, it suggests they are successfully appealing to Scottish voters who feel abandoned by both Labour and the SNP and are looking for something different. The Greens have had some success in Scotland with their progressive environmental and social policies, and could pick up seat from both Labour and the SNP by appealing to younger, more idealistic voters.